Hello, I'm Sumit Bose, founder of Future Net Zero. We are a website that produces content to help you cut your carbon footprint. And the Net Hero podcast is all about that, highlighting people doing amazing things to cut emissions, be that scientists, business people, inventors, or just common, ordinary people who are doing something to make a change. If you want to get involved, then email us. And we're looking for a sponsor for this amazing podcast. So if you'd like to know more, get in touch. On to this week's episode. Welcome to this episode. Now, the energy transition. Everyone talks about it. That's what the flipping point of Future Net Zero and our podcast is. But there's one thing that we never really talk about. We never talk about how we are going to clean the transition. So most people would say, just build loads of wind turbines. Let's build loads of solar panels. My personal view is we need everything. We need nuclear. We need a range of ways of it, carbon capture, whatever. But whatever we do, you have to make the things, right? You're going to have to make a power plant. You're going to have to make your carbon capture devices. You're going to have to make power lines. You're going to have to make loads of stuff. And one of the fundamental building blocks of all of that we've taken for granted for centuries is steel. But how do you clean up steel? Because there's no point saying we've got a wonderful clean energy system because we've got these beautiful kind of turbines sticking up, and yet the carbon footprint, or the embedded carbon as people call it, of the steel that makes it is enormous. It's a challenge governments and companies are looking at around the world, and today we're going to explore that. I'm delighted to say I'm joined by Annie Heaton, the CEO of a group called Responsible Steel. Annie, hello. Welcome to the podcast.
Thanks very much for having me.
Before we get into it, just outline why steel matters. And in fact, what is steel? Let's go back to 101 basics. People kind of know iron. I remember my school days, the Stone Age, then the Iron Age. No one ever talked about the Steel Age, but you could say that was the Industrial Revolution, wasn't it?
That's right. And what we're going through now is the next industrial revolution, isn't it? And if we think about how long that industrial revolution took then, we haven't got that time now. And yet steel is, as you've rightly said, it's a fundamental part of our society that we kind of take for granted. And before I started working in steel 12 years ago, I never really stopped to think how much steel is all around us. And when you look at the furniture in your house, you know, the whether it's the kettle that you're boiling your tea from, the handles on the doors, the legs of the tables, the desks that you have.
Yeah, exactly the one I'm sitting at. Yeah.
And that's before we've even begun to think about the steel that goes into wind turbines and solar panels. In fact, you know, if you look at the energy transition over time, as you've gone from coal to gas to modern gas cycle turbines to wind to solar, per megawatt hour generated, you've needed more and more steel. So the embodied steel in our lifestyles and in our energy system today is incredibly important. And steel, along with cement, concrete, glass, and aluminium, these are the fundamental things that actually are very, very energy hungry that we need to decarbonize in order to build our future that is made of sustainable materials.
What is steel? Because people sort of get the idea that it's an alloy. There's lots of things go into steel, and there's lots of grades of steel depending on what you do, isn't there?
Yeah. So if you go back to your kind of school chemistry, you've first of all got iron ore that you extract from the ground. That then you need to take the oxygen out of the ore. So you need to separate the iron from the oxygen to make it your iron, and then you need to convert that iron into steel. And steel is a whole cocktail of metallurgies. So it can be you can have high alloy steel, which might have a lot of chromium or nickel in it, like stainless steel. You might have a whole range of other different alloys that give it different properties. So, for example, electrical steels that are used in a generator have very specific properties. The steel, like we were saying in wind turbines, the heavy plate has got to be a certain property to be able to stand up and take the forces of nature. The steel in a car has got to be lightweight to enable the car not to use so much energy as it travels, but it's got to be strong enough to withstand impact, and it's got to be able to crumple to be safer in the case of an accident, for example. So there's a huge amount of actual innovation that's gone on in the last, I would say, particularly 20 years
Well,
to get steel to where it is today.
it's one of those things, I look around, like you said, if you're building a house extension, there's a roof support. Everything that we have, from dress and drawers to cars and, laptops and everything, has got it in there. Is it a material that we have just taken for granted? Because I've never really thought about it. I mean, you just kind of think, well, I get on a bus, don't really know what it's made of. I get on a tube, don't really think about that. The power that the laptop is running off is coming on cables. Is that steel? I have no idea. It's just sort of become part of our fabric, compared to perhaps generations ago where, you were much more with nature, you had wood and all of these. Has it just kind of become ubiquitous, a part of, our life? So we don't really think of it the way that perhaps we think of things like, watching a chimney and the smoke coming up, or the exhaust from a car. You don't actually think about the car, do you?
Yeah, exactly. It's a kind of invisible service of modern life. That's right. But the really great thing is, as we've been using steel over the decades, we've actually built up an incredibly critical resource, which is called scrap.
Yeah.
And the stocks of scrap available today make up a third of the total global production. So it means that for all of the steel that we use, we can make a third of it from scrap that was made in the past. Sorry, from steel that was made in the past.
Wow.
We can recycle it. By the end of this century, we hope, and the projections kind of indicate, that we should be able to make all of the steel that we need from scrap. So we've got actually a permanent resource in steel. And that's something that, it takes a bit of thinking about. Once you've got it, it's incredibly sustainable material.
Because you can reuse it again and again.
You can use it again and again and again. It's only if it's left to rust that it will eventually degrade back into nature.
Oh yeah, that's true. Quick question: does steel rust? Because you sort of think of stainless steel fork, but you don't.
Yeah, it oxidizes.
It does over time. So let's talk about emissions, right? That's what this is all about. And before we'll go into what responsible steel does in a minute, but I just want to take the viewers and listeners through this. I think this is from your site or whatever, your facts, that if steel was a country, its carbon footprint, it would be the third biggest emitter in the globe. Is that right?
The fourth at the last time we looked, yeah. But it's still pretty sizable. I think the other way to look at it, if you think of all the emissions that are from the energy system in the world.
Yeah.
So if you forget about agriculture for a minute, just think of the energy system. It makes up 10%. That's just steel.
Wow.
Right? And then you've got cement and concrete and aluminium and glass and so on. But steel is a very hungry material for energy. And it's a historical fact that we have, up until now, made steel from coal,
of course,
which is a very dense energy dense material. It's also very cheap. It has been very cheap to extract in terms of the planetary costs, the carbon that's been emitted over the last 150 years. That's exactly why we're here today, and that's the piece that needs to change. And it's the coal that is used to separate the iron from the oxygen, so to reduce the iron ore into iron. And that's the most energy hungry part of the process.
But that's basically heat, though, isn't it? Or is there a particular characteristic to coal itself, the carbon in the coal, that is vital to this process?
If you talk to a chemist, they would say it's a reductant.
Right.
So it's actually what takes the oxygen molecules away from the iron molecules and breaks that bond. It's also, in the way that steel is made today in a blast furnace, the coal is also used to weigh down the iron in the furnace. So it's got a physical property as well. So there are attempts to replace coal with bio coke, but it's not as heavy as coal. So that's one of the issues.
So actually, this is really interesting. My ignorance was that coal was used just to make it hot, right? It's the heat that you use it. So you're actually saying it has a fundamental part in the fabrication of the steel. Of
the iron, yeah. It has a chemical role to play as well. But I mean, of course, it also brings the heat, what enables that chemical reaction to take place.
So this is where the issue is, and I think you've really helped me understand, hopefully our listeners, that getting the idea that you can just swap to, let's use lots of electricity, a few wind turbines, and we generate the electricity that way, or we move to hydrogen to do the heat side of it. It's not that easy. Then it's not as simple as that.
Well, it's not as simple as replacing the electricity. The electricity will have a big role to play, but that's largely in the metallurgy and the steel making part. So when you see in the news in the UK of Port Talbot have just ordered an electric arc furnace.
Yes.
That's once the iron is there, you can then use the electric arc furnace. Or if you don't want to use iron and you can use scrap instead, then you can melt that in the electric arc furnace. So that's the second stage. But for the first stage, the reduction of the iron ore, if you're not using scrap and you're using primary material, iron ore, then you need to reduce it. So then you can use coal, you can use natural gas. So you've got to use a natural gas is a hydrocarbon. So you've got carbon and hydrogen there, or you could use hydrogen. So again, if you go back to your chemistry books, both carbon and hydrogen can be used for that catalytic reaction to reduce the iron ore. So the difficulty then is if you use hydrogen, you can't use it you can use it to some extent in a blast furnace, but you're still going to need something to weigh down the iron ore. The alternative is to move to another kind of furnace called the direct iron reduction furnace, and that can be used just on gas. So at the moment, DRIs around the world, there's only one in Europe at the moment, but there's several in other parts of the world that are using natural gas. And the quest is to replace that natural gas with hydrogen. So if we think of the future energy needs, electricity for the steel making part, and hydrogen to replace coal. Now, depending on where you are in the world, you've got different levels of access to the kind of scale of renewable energy that is needed to produce hydrogen. And actually, nobody is producing hydrogen today in a way that's economically viable. No. And that's the biggest challenge. I'm sure you've done podcasts on this subject. Yeah,
we have. We have an audience that is pro hydrogen, anti hydrogen. So there's a mix.
I can imagine. And at Responsible Steel, we're kind of technology agnostic. There are a number of different ways to transition the steel industry, and in different countries, different companies will pursue different routes. The hydrogen is one route, and I think a lot of store has been put on it, but it is going to be very challenging to get the economics, the economies of scale right in time. There's going to be another route called direct electrolysis, which will come in over time, and in that route, we're just actually directly reducing the iron with electricity. That is a novel technology that is at a much lower stage of development than the hydrogen technology. So it's ramping up. There's going to be an industrial demonstration in a few years' time, but we're looking at 2035 before that's going to be really viable commercially. So again, it comes back to time. So what a lot of the steelmakers are doing today is adapting their blast furnaces to capture more of the gases that come from the process and reuse them in different ways. And those that they can't reuse, then they are looking at how to bury and store them. So carbon capture and storage. So those are the three different routes: your hydrogen, your carbon capture and storage, and your direct electrolysis. And then let's not forget that over time, as we move forward, there will be more and more scrap available, and that'll be a bigger part of the story.
What does Responsible Steel do? You were telling me before we recorded, started in 2016, and you've got a mix of sort of members, aren't you? You do some certification. Can you take our audience through what you actually do as a body?
We are a multi-stakeholder organisation, so we're made up of both business and civil society members. And we also have a large number of what we call associate members, which are drawn from academia, from trade associations, from other standards organisations. But on the business side, we're talking steelmakers, their customers and their suppliers. And on the civil society side, we really aim to get a wide representation of the sustainability sphere, because Responsible Steel is not just about decarbonisation. And that's really important. I mean, our mission is not just to drive the delivery of net zero steel, but to drive it in a way that's socially and environmentally responsible. You look at any heavy industry, and they've had their fair share of sustainability issues, environmental issues, pollution issues, resources issues. And then social issues, whether it's around land rights or issues around labour, issues around human rights, both in the steelmaking industry, but also upstream in the mining industry and the shipping industry. So we take a kind of complete value chain approach, and we look at the whole value chain of steel, what it takes to make steel in a way that's socially and environmentally responsible.
Do you have environmentalists as part of your group? Do you have sort of?
Yeah, absolutely. So we've got NGOs with climate interests, NGOs with nature and biodiversity interests, like flora and fauna.
Yeah.
And we've got trade unions. We've got the International Trade Union for the steel industry that covers the steel industry, Industrial. And our board is made up of those interests. So as I say, we've got flora and fauna, Industrial, the climate group on our board. We've also got 3 steel companies and a construction company on our board as well. And then we've got 3 independent directors.
At the end of the day, the people who listen to this are generally working in the energy sector, and they're making decisions to reduce carbon, right? They're making a decision to say, we're going to move to CHP, or we're going to put solar panels, or we're going to do the turbines, or we're going to use batteries, all of this. And there are decisions that governments are making about how we decarbonize and move that forward. Very often, policy drives a lot of this. But there's another factor that is vital and brings everything to being scuppered, and that's finance. And that's the economic cost of doing things. This tension has always been there and always will be there. Where do we sit with that in the steel industry? Because there's a fundamental cost. Yeah, I get what you're saying about there'll be more of the old steel that we can use the scrap. But at present, there's still people making the stuff. People are still digging it up, and they're still having to make it and put it all together. And then that stuff has to be shipped and pushed out, etc., etc. And there's a cost. There's a cost of the raw materials, there's the cost of the digging, there's the cost of the energy as well, which is all associated with it. For the vision of I think the IEA said that they want the steel industry to reduce its emissions by 90%, I think by 2050. Mick, correct me if I'm wrong on that. But, it's such a fundamental part of what we've discussed on this podcast so far. It is basically the structure of everything we'll build in our cleaner future. So how does that pressure of politics and economics play out when you're talking to your members or you're trying to see the global picture around it? It might work in some parts of the world and it doesn't work in others.
Now, this is exactly the challenge. The technology has been known for a while, the hydrogen CCS routes that I talked about.
Yeah.
Even this electrolysis technology has been around for 15 years or so. So it's not the technology that's the issue, it's the cost of implementing it and the cost of the energy that's needed to fuel the technology. So you're not going to get, steel is incredibly capital intensive, and you're not going to get the steel company to change their kit just because it's the right thing to do, because they'll be out of business if they do, because it'll be 40 times expensive.
Absolutely.
Right? So they really, and this is where leadership on sustainability in steel, and particularly on decarbonisation, is really hard, because you've got to find ways to make it cost less, in advance of your competitors. You can't just do it because it's the right thing. So you've got to work with a whole manner of stakeholders to enable that to happen. So you can work with your mining suppliers to get better grade iron ore. That helps. You can work with energy suppliers to book renewable energy 10 years into the future, so you can ensure and guarantee that you're going to have that electricity. You've got to do that at a huge scale for a steel plant. But ultimately, you've also got to work with the people who are buying your steel.
Us, the consumer at the end.
Right. Yeah. So, there has been copious surveys that say the consumer says in all parts of the world, very interesting, that they would be prepared to pay another $100 on a car if it was made from near zero steel.
Yeah.
The truth of it is, the automotive industry is in trouble itself. It's an incredibly competitive industry. And they want to make greener cars. They want to make it with embodied low emission steel, but they're not prepared to pay for it. So then you've got to create a market that mandates it. And that's what's happened in renewable energy. That's what's happened with tailpipe emissions from the automotive industry.
Yeah.
That's what's happened in many countries on the embodied emissions of buildings. So we need actually government to step in. And if you're going to have a policy that regulates either how much low emission steel a car needs to contain by what date, or how much low emissions steel a building needs to contain by what date, then you need to define what does that look like, low emission steel, right? Near zero steel is the sort of the end point. That is the real nirvana that we're all sort of chasing. But the reality is we've got to take a stepwise approach, and first of all be asking for low emission steel, because that's what's realistic today. So you could put in a new furnace that can take natural gas or hydrogen tomorrow and run it on natural gas. The hydrogen's too expensive, but at least if you run it with natural gas, you can almost halve the emissions. So that would be an incredibly positive step. But even so, that's capital intensive. But if a policy then says that the steel coming from that kind of plant, or the steel that comes from a really well-run scrap-based plant is permissible in our new market, then the steelmakers are going to be much more incentivized to invest accordingly. But in order for either the customer to say, this is what we need from the steelmaker, we need low emission steel, or the policymaker to say, to mandate this market, we need some definitions around this. And in order to put definitions, you've got to then, first of all, you've got to strip it right back to actually, how are you accounting for the carbon embodied in that steel?
This is the exact point. So how do I know? You said that the term is quite interesting. You're talking about zero emission or near zero, you said, right? Who's making, and I know you guys do some of this, but is there a standard that says, right, this is steel, I'm going to use some vernaculars here, this is dirty steel, right? This is made of, I don't know, whatever, and it produces this much emissions. This steel is cleaner because it's 20% less. And this steel is super clean because it's 5%. Is there anything like that? Is there a sliding scale? Is there some sort of certification that gives us as the consumers, the people who are buying it, the belief, like in the energy system, they've changed to say, right, this is really green electricity and not just cool green because it's actually come from a renewable source. Is that happening? And how much is Responsible Steel involved in that?
Absolutely. In fact, that's exactly what Responsible Steel released in 2022 is a scheme just as you described. So we just to wind back a little bit, because I think it's worth saying that Responsible Steel is not just about decarbonisation; it's about the broader sustainability picture. And so our original standard was about 13 different aspects of sustainability. We produced that in 2019. Right. We then, and at that time, the stakeholders involved in the discussion, there was such an intense discussion on how do you define low emission steel? How do you define near zero steel? That we said, look, let's just take that as a separate question and deal with it separately. So between 2019 and 2022, that's what we were doing. And we produced that standard, and it does exactly that. It says, look, there are 4 different levels of progress.
Right.
The end point is where we want to be in 2050. That's near zero. And that's defined by the IEA, the International Energy Agency. And the starting point to say what is at least not dirty steel is steel that is better than average.
Right.
Okay. So our first progress level, we will award a certificate to is a steel that not only meets all of our own other sustainability principles, but is better than average. And we think actually that's worth acknowledging.
Yeah.
So that's.
But can you give me a percentage? Could you say, like, if we said 100% is kind of, the standard steel produces 100% of emissions. No, it doesn't, but you know what I mean. You'd say better than is at 80, or better than is at 40. Is there a number, or is there a grade?
Well, I suppose in a sense, by saying that the starting point is average, that's 50%, isn't it? So 50% of the world's steel is better than average today. We need all of that steel to be better than average by 2030, and a lot more of it to be 25% less. So our second progress level is what you might say is lower emission steel, is 25% better than average.
Right. Okay.
And then low emission steel is 25% further, right? So you've got 4 different progress levels, and we want to get to everybody better than the averages today by 2030. And then we need a considerable amount to be at our second progress level, lower emission steel. And the IEA says we need about 8% of steel to be near zero by 2030, right? And there are a lot of projects that have been designed to be producing near zero steel by 2030, but a lot of them have not actually got to final investment decision. And a lot of that is because of the energy problem that we've already talked about.
Of course. Yeah.
But they also want predictability from policymakers. So
don't we all?
And predictability means you've got to settle on these definitions. So the IEA has done some great stuff. They actually just published a paper last week at COP29. They and Responsible Steel and a lot of different other players in the industry have been talking about these definitions. How can we actually land on some common definitions? If policymakers can do that, then the world would be a much simpler place. But of course, policymakers do tend to want to do their own thing in their own national context. They all have their own sort of their own system way of doing things.
Well, they've got their own pressures as well. Before we go, just we're sort of running out of time. There's a couple of quick things I want to ask you. Globally, and you say globally, are there any areas? I don't think anyone's doing it, and we said before we started recording that no one's actually got to this cleaner steel yet. But are you seeing? Is there progress in certain parts of the world? Is there any pattern to that, or is it kind of just everyone sort of moving as they do, depending where they are?
Well, there's a tremendous amount of effort that is now coming together to really ensure that we get some of these near zero projects over the line by 2030. You'll find projects in Sweden, for example, with Stegra, that used to be called H2 Green, with SSAB. They're both doing the hydrogen thing. You've also got potential projects in the Middle East, potential projects in India, Brazil. So there's a lot of work going on, and the US potentially as well, because Biden's Inflation Reduction Act has been incredibly successful at getting some of these bigger energy pieces into place.
What about the UK?
Well, the UK has gone for the sort of scrap-based approach.
Right.
So 100% electricity, if the UK could actually use 100% scrap, then it would be there. But let's not also forget that scrap-based steel is limited at the moment in the kind of products it can produce.
Yeah, I thought that would be the case. Yeah.
So that's perhaps another conversation. But you're always at the moment going to need both kinds of steel to produce all the different products that we do. So the UK has in Wales there's electric arc furnaces that's been put on order now. So that'll be coming. We don't know what the future will be, where the iron will come from if they're not using 100% scrap. And it could be coming from Holland, which has also got a hydrogen project underway, and they're looking at shipping in liquid hydrogen into Holland. So that's another option. But I mean, this thinking is going on at different levels. But is it going to happen tomorrow? Very unlikely, except in a very small handful of cases. Is it potentially going to happen by 2035? If the policymakers act now, then yes. But the real thing, and this is the conversation at COP over the last couple of weeks, is let's get the standards agreed. That's how we measure it and how we define it. And then let's get the policy to create the demand, to create the markets that make the whole thing work. And that's what's happened in renewable energy. That's what we need in steel.
Brilliant place to end. Thank you so much, Annie, for your time. I think you've really helped me understand, and hopefully our audience as well. I think there's plenty more, and I'd like to bring you back again and talk a bit more. We'll talk about, because I think it's a fundamental thing. So hope you'll join me again on the podcast sometime soon.
Great. No, thanks so much, Sumit.
No, my pleasure. Thank you for listening, and please tell us what you think about the whole idea of cleaner steel. I think it's a fundamental part of our energy transition. And if you've got a story you'd like to feature, or you think you should come on the podcast, get in touch. nethero@futurenetzero.com. See you soon.
You've just heard the Net Hero podcast from futurenetzero.com. Join us as we help you find ways to cut your carbon footprint as we head towards net zero. Subscribe and follow us on social media. FutureNetZero.com. Better business, better planet.